Hello, everybody, and welcome to HHH in a very busy day for me, where I'm speaking this morning as part of our ongoing History Half Hour and speaking later on today on Lockdown University, which you can just contact Lockdown University to come onto it if you wish, where I'll be speaking on the Sistine Chapel and all its beauty. Today, we are moving through Russian history. Now, Kiev, which of course is Ukraine, is the capital and the most populous city of the Ukraine, and by the 16th century was recognized as a spiritual center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and was viewed by Christians and Ukrainians to today as a holy city, not just an ordinary city, but a holy city with a specialness for the world of Christianity. Now, Jews had lived in Kiev, or Kiev, whichever way you wish to pronounce it, and established their importance there as early as the 12th century. And we know that because there was correspondence between rabbis in Kiev, between Rabbeinu Tam in France and those there in the Ukraine. Now, Rabbeinu Tam is one of the premiership rabbis, the grandson of Rashi himself, and was living in France. So we can see that the French Ashkenaz, Western Ashkenaz way was moving over towards the east. By the 14th century, Jews being protected, a situation which existed for much of Jewry in much of the world of that time, and many actually did very well. They amassed quite a fortune. Jews were not always in poverty. And alongside their success, there were also notable scholars. And one of the major issues influencing and affecting what the rabbis were dealing with at that particular time of the 14th century was the matter of the Karaites. And to remind ourselves, the Karaites were those Jews who, and there are still a few today in Jerusalem and in Lithuania, who believed that there was no such thing as they viewed it as rabbinic oral tradition, but you had to keep according to what the Torah said. So if the Torah said you should have no heating on the Sabbath, so they would sit in the cold. If the Torah said you should have no lighting on the Sabbath, they would sit in the dark. And the Karaites were a very influential group, and they could well have taken over Jewry as we know it, but in the end they lost out to the Rabbinites, the rabbis who controlled Jewry, and that is what we are essentially today. So the Karaites exist as a part of history and a very small group. You could actually go to a Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem. If you went to the Ukraine today, and you went into one of the main central squares in the Ukraine, in Kiev, there you would see a magnificent statue erected tall of a man on a horse. And that is the Cossack Ukrainian of Khmelnitsky, Bogdan Khmelnitsky. To the Ukrainians, and true today, Bogdan Khmelnitsky is a hero. He is one of the founders of what we would call, in our modern language, a Ukrainian state. And he would advance through as a Cossack, and he would slaughter the Poles and establish the hegemony of the Ukraine against their Polish overlords. At the same time, Bogdan Khmelnitsky did kill a lot of Jews, but that is part and parcel of what went on in the world at that particular time and others. And we don't want to dwell too much on the killing of Jews. It's so on all the time. So we're not going to dwell on that. But it was a period when he was slaughtering Jews in 1648, 1649, a period of when the Jews were negotiating to come back into England, and when there was a move towards the coming of the Messiah, who at that time was believed to be by many people Shabbatai Tzvi. So that's the world that we're living in. We're living in the world of Shabbatai Tzvi, negotiations of the Jews coming back into England, and Jews being slaughtered in Russia, Poland, Kiev, places such as that. Now, Khmelnitsky made a very interesting move, and that's with us too today, because they place Ukraine under Russian protection. Ukraine as an area at that time was to be part of the Russian Empire under the Tsars. But as far as the Jews were concerned, the Russians were more antagonistic to the Jews than even the Ukrainians were, and that would continue on. Now the Jews were, it's all happened again and again, the Jews are thrown out and allowed back in and thrown out and allowed back in. And eventually, after being thrown out during the period of Khmelnitsky, they arrived back in Kiev in around 1793. And although the city was viewed, as I've already stated, as a holy city, it was a city which, if there were Jews there, was profaned by the presence of Jews who were known in Russian literature as, and many others, as Christ killers. But that didn't stop the Jews doing well. The Jews did rather well. They built synagogues, and when trades took place on an annual basis or more in Kiev, the Jews were prominent as the merchants in the fairs and way beyond their numbers. Now, Kiev was a place of a Jewish population which in 1863 was just 3%. Just 3% of the people in Kiev were Jews. And yet, in less than 10 years, they were now nearly 12% of the population. The Jews, so it's not a place, even allowing for the history where Jews were killed and slaughtered here and there, did not stop the Jews moving in together. It became the place to be and to be successful. And despite, again, the pogroms that resulted as a result of the killing of Alexander II, and where you go to the Church of Spilled Blood, if you go to St. Petersburg, the Jewish population kept increasing and was probably even greater than the census, which was taken at times, illuminated, simply because there were many Jews, and that may well go on today with the census, who do not want to put their names down. And so when they give a percentage of the number of Jews, it is actually less than you would surmise. In 1897 now, remember there were 11.8% Jews, there are now 12.8% Jews. And while there had been 11,000 Jews in the 1860s, there were by 1890s, they were now 31,000 Jews. So this is obviously a place which was successful and a place where Jews wanted to be. And Jews represented some of the wealthiest magnates of the time. There were Jewish lawyers, there were Jewish professionals, there were Jewish doctors, and they were heavily involved in the sugar industry. And students flocked into Kiev University, where they represented, remember they were just 3 or 4% of population, they represented 17% of the students. The Hebrew writers did well. Sholem Aleichem lived in Kiev. He lived there over a period of 2 areas, one at the end of the 19th century and then one going from the 19th into the 20th century. He lived there for nearly 10 years. And in his fictional work, he referred to Kiev as Yehupitz, which is a Yiddish pronunciation of the Ukrainian word for Egypt. And that's what Sholem Aleichem in his literature, in his fiction, referred to Kiev as a sort of Egypt, but in a Yiddish word. Now, the first there were 2 Russian revolutions. Many people was only one, but there were 2. And the first one was in 1905. And again, and to be rather boring. It results in pogroms and more killing of Jews, but not in this case quite so many. It didn't stop Kiev at that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, becoming one of the wealthiest communities in the whole of Russia. And there were what were known as Aesopian synagogues. Now that's a new word, and Aesopian is from the tales of Aesop, where you pretend to be one thing, but you're actually another. And the way they got around restrictions of building synagogues was that you had a mansion, and you showed the authorities you had a mansion, and whilst their backs were turned, you turned the mansion into a synagogue. So they were known as the Aesopian synagogues, i.e. heavily disguised synagogues. So as if nobody would have noticed. But if you get an opportunity to look at the synagogue, the Brodsky Choral Synagogue on YouTube, you can see how magnificent it is. And it has a very interesting history. It's named Brodsky because Brodsky was the sugar magnate of the time, one of those people heavily involved. Now, Golda Meir was born in poverty in Kiev, but there is one more famous individual that many of you and many of us have never heard of, and he was Rabbi Shlomo Aronson. Now, he was the chief rabbi of Kiev from 1906 to 1920. That's Aronson, as in Aaron's son. And he fled eventually to the land of Israel, where he would become the first Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He was, as was stated at his funeral, one of the outstanding figures in Jewish orthodoxy. But we've never heard of him because he was living in a part of the world where people just didn't hear of him. And at his funeral, Rav Kook spoke, the great Rav Kook, spoke about the rabbi who was the leader of Lubavitch and once arrested by the Bolsheviks. And although he was extremely religious, he had a way of speaking to those who had settled in the land of Israel exactly as Rav Kook did. And he viewed the irreligious colonists in a different way. Said he, those who have an apparent indifference to some of ancient Jewish ritual, and this is a man who was particular in the observance of Jewish ritual, what we would call orthodoxy, he condoned because he felt that in Palestine the Jews were creating a new vision of the ancient religious experience. And therefore, what they were doing was religious. It may not be what you have assumed to be religious, but their settlement of the land was in itself an act of orthodoxy, is what this rabbi said. Now, this chief rabbi in Kiev lived through momentous times. He lived through the First World War. He lived through the revolution, but he is referred to, and he is known because of what is known as the Beilis affair, which is what we are alluding today with the background in Kiev. Now, in Kiev, there was a tendency, as there was in the whole of Russia, whether it was in the Pale of Settlement or outside it, great anti-Semitic tendency, and this was much more virulent and much more nasty than the anti-Semitism which was going on at the same time in Germany and France. While Germany and France was more philosophical anti-Semitism, often in the written word, there didn't tend to be attack on Jews. Whilst in Russia and the Russian domains, when you had anti-Semitic outbursts, it tended to be violent with the death of Jews. And the Jews were used by the Tsars as a scapegoat for their problems. And if they needed to blame anybody for what was going on in Tsarist Russia, it would be by blaming the Jews. And the Jews could be, well, blamed for everything, really. There were two anti-Semitic themes, which are the background to what is known as the Beilis affair. One of them, coming from what was developing at the time, is the idea that the Jews were plotting to overtake the world. They were going to conquer the world. And there were thousands, millions of people probably, who believed that as a result of a work known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It is a work which I've read, and you can get yourself bored within about 3 pages of it. But nonetheless, this impressed people. And the origin of the work is long and confusing and bizarre, and nobody quite knows where it comes from and who wrote it, and etc. But it was based on a work known as The Mystery of Jewry, a booklet of total nonsense. And it revealed the truth of the Jews and their control of the world. And it seemed to come originally from Paris in France. There was another theme which the Russians also poured out, was the very old accusation emanating from England itself in Norwich, the idea of ritual murder. And the Jews would take Christian children and murder them for their blood. And said, quoting, whether it is true and believable that Jews secretly killed Christian children and used their blood. Now, these ideas were spread by a pamphlet and a periodical which came itself from the Vatican. So the Vatican could not deny that they were not responsible for the spreading of this nonsense of ritual murder. And this work was known as Civiltà Cattolica. And this particular work, Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, very controversial philosopher, I should say, was the most anti-Semitic, she said, the most anti-Semitic magazine in the world at the time, Civiltà Cattolica. And this was produced all the time, and it tended to go on and on, not on the idea of the Jews plotting to take over the world, but that the Jews carried out ritual murder. Now, the last case that this particular periodical deals with is the accusation and trial of Menachem Mendel Beilis of Kiev. Now, his name being Menachem Mendel gives a clue to his background, which was Chabad Lubavitch. Now, Menachem Mendel Beilis came from a background, a Hasidic background, but he was not in any way religious. This was not part of his life, although that matter is also debated as how religious he was or he wasn't. But he came essentially what we would call from a non-observant background. He worked at a brick factory on the outskirts of Kiev, and he worked on every Saturday. He was not a Sabbath observer. He worked on the Sabbath. We know that because there were invoices which he received and which he signed on the Sabbath day. This is a fundamental point, as we shall see. Shabbat, Saturday, Sabbath, March the 19th, 1911. Andrei Yushinsky, aged 13, a young boy, disappears. Now, Jews throughout history, whether it was in England or throughout the period of history we're dealing with, whether it was in England, France, Germany, wherever, Jews always feared when Christian children went missing because that they would be accused of having killed that child. And this particular occasion on March the 19th, 1911 was no exception. The body of Yushinsky was found in a cave about a week later. And the police immediately suspected not Beilis, but Vera Sheveniak, who was there a leader, the woman, but she was a leader of a criminal gang in Kiev and was well known with her and her children and her husband as being heavily involved in crime. But the reactionary, anti-Semitic movement known as the Black Hundreds, who were there with the support of the Tsars, was an organization which wanted to be rid of Jews and tended to accuse Jews of crimes wherever they could. And they were involved then in actions against the Jews, whether it would be killing Jews, pogroms, destroying their property, or any other means of anti-Semitism of that particular time. They took up the Beilis affair, and they said, going back to the two things which were going on in Russia, whether it was Jews controlling the world or ritual murder, they said, this boy wasn't killed by Vera and her criminal gang. This boy was killed by Beilis, Menachem Mendel Beilis, and they're somehow associated with the Chabad Lubavitch movement, who themselves want to control the world, it is said at that time. And they placed the matter before the anti-Semitic Tsar that we know was eventually assassinated. Said they, did not the emperor himself call on all of us to rally under the banner of the Union of Russians? This is what the Black Hundreds were known as well, the Union of Russians, this heavily anti-Jewish movement, which said about the Union of Russians, which openly advocates the annihilation of the Jews. Beilis was arrested, and he was held in prison for 2 years. And he was approached at different times to admit to his crime. And if you admit to your crime or give some semblance of reason to your particular time, you'll be released. And he awaited trial in a place that no Jew wanted to await trial in front of a judge who would probably be anti-Jewish, in front of a jury that came mainly from the Black Hundreds who would be anti-Jewish. And what chance would a Jew have, being, even if he was completely innocent, of being held in such circumstances? Then the world became aware of this particular case. And the Russian literary center became aware of this case. And the Jews around Russia became aware of this case. And even a Yiddish postcard was printed at that time of 1911, commemorating the blood libel of which Beilis was accused. Said this in the artwork there. It was a Yiddish verse, so I have a copy of the postcard, which says, "Oh, this is the martyred Jew. When a Jew is falsely accused, he will get often the title of a martyr. Now, the name is known around the world," which by then it was, "and he languished for years in prison." We know he was there for 2 years, which he did, "in the dark land of pogroms," which it was. And this postcard was printed. There was a prosecution case, and there was a defense case. And it went to a trial where the majority of the 12 men, obviously, who were there on the jury, 7 of them at least, were members of the Black Hundreds, virulently anti-Jewish. Said the prosecution case. It is quite simply, and we know it, and we will prove it, and we will show it, and we will get people to come from all over Russia, if need be, to show that this was a case of ritual murder, that this boy had been stabbed numerous times in a way that only Jews do. And this was supported by that Italian Vatican press, which said that the Jews were using their blood for that often used crime of matzahs. And that's an interesting story in itself, but we won't go there. The Jews were using the blood for the matzahs. And to prove their case, they called on experts. Experts included one priest, a Father Justinus Pranaitis. It is said that he was an expert on Talmud. He was a man who understood what was in Talmud, and he could see in the Talmud that the Jews did commit blood libel, and they did have ritual murder, and it was written up in an anti-Semitic work which he wrote called the Talmud Unmasked, and he was called upon as an expert. Professor Kosaratov from the Imperial Academy of St. Petersburg testified and proved from the number of stab wounds on the body, which he said were 13, which was a particularly Jewish number, was a victim of ritual murder. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the third Rebbe of Chabad, was implicated. As they said, all cases of ritual murder could be traced to the Schneerson family. This was put before the jury to show the guilt of Beilis, and then the defense came to their part. Pranaitis, this priest who was an expert on the Talmud, who knew no Hebrew, who knew no Aramaic, and soon the defense went to him and was, okay, there's a one about where somebody is asked, what is the Gettysburg Address? Where will you find it? Give me the actual street number of it. And that was a similar argument used here. Said he, they asked the priest, when did Baba Basra live and what was her activity? And Baba Basra is, of course, a title of a particular tractate of the Talmud, which means the last gate. But Basra, which means gate in Aramaic, however, in Russian, Baba is the same word as Buba, meaning grandmother. So they began to ask him when, and of course he didn't know, because he didn't know anything about it, and he was completely ridiculed. And Beilis was at work. It was a Saturday. On that Sabbath, he was at work, and they could prove it. And the man who accused Beilis of having done the ritual murder, his testimony was completely pulled apart. And the expert who said there were 13 stab wounds proving it was a ritual murder was found there were actually only 12 stab wounds. The Jews never indulged. It was shown in blood taking or killing children. And Rabbi Aronson, the rabbi that we met, He went there in order to appeal to the right-wing members of the anti-Semitic group to show that this is all a nonsense. A government, that one of the Tsar's government came forward and said an accusation about blood libel is a relic of the past. Literary attorneys with knowledge and access spoke up on behalf of Beilis. So the trial came to a decision. The jury, as I've said, filled with men who were virulently anti-Jewish, didn't know what to say. There was actually no proof whatsoever that Beilis, this man from Kiev in the 20th century, had been guilty of killing any child at all. And they said, how can we convict Beilis if nothing is said about him at the trial itself? That his name hardly ever actually came up. They were always arguing about other things. So two questions had to be answered in this now worldwide famous Beilis affair. Did Menachem Mendel Beilis commit murder? And did he commit ritual murder? Even if he didn't kill, did he actually also commit ritual murder? Did he stab this child in order to take his blood for religious purposes? The jury was asked, did Beilis commit ritual murder? And the jury said, yes. They were asked, the jury, did Menachem Mendel Beilis commit murder? And the answer was not guilty. So therefore we have this strange situation with Beilis. Whilst he was found not guilty of murder, the principle that Jews carried out ritual murder and took the blood of children still existed there and went forward as an accusation. So what was the aftermath? What happened to Beilis? What happened to him and his family? He was married, he had 5 children, and he moved away in 1914 to then what was called Palestine, and he was wanting to stay there. Others asked him to move, to go somewhere else, like New York. It wasn't suitable in Palestine, and those people who had organizations that had promised to support him did not support him. And he wrote then, when he moved eventually to New York, he wrote his story called The Story of My Sufferings. Like many people who become famous in history and are only famed because of a particular incident, and this goes on to many people like Kastner and here Beilis, where they are very well known and have a very high profile. In fact, he had no profile after the incident. And when he moved to New York, he was not supported, and one of his children committed suicide, and unsupported and poor, he died in 1934. And he is buried in Queens. And it's interesting that he is buried in the same cemetery as Sholem Aleichem, who we've mentioned, and he's buried in the same cemetery as someone known as Leo Frank, who we will come to next week for other reasons. And on his headstone, which is more than just a flat slab, is the word martyr, and the principle and the age-old idea that when a Jew is killed or dies in such circumstances, he is a martyr. Today, we know of the Beilis trial, and it's memorialized, and you can read it and you can watch the film, in the film and the book known as The Fixer. And The Fixer is a 1966 film, which you can get hold of and read it. The book and the film is heavily contentious. It is argued against by the family themselves, now the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Beilis, who still fight for his name and fight for his name against what is implied in the film. So that today, ladies and gentlemen, is the case of the Beilis affair, before we move on next week to a title of a talk known as A Bottle of Coca-Cola. What does that have to do with Jewish history. But that is while sipping a cold Coke we can dwell on till next week. And some of you I'll see tonight at 5 o'clock. I wish you all a very happy 5th day of the week. Bye-bye.